It's Bernard Nomberg, another episode of Nomberg Law Live, coming at you almost every Tuesday. I'm so pleased to have Lars Anderson. Good morning, Lars.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yes, sir. And Lars has got so many things, great things to share with us. So we'll jump right in. And if you don't know of Lars, he is not the former American wrestler from years ago. He is not the former Major League or minor league baseball player. But we've got the best of the three with us. And Lars, I'm so thankful you're giving me a little bit of your time this morning.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I know you to now be a transplanted Nebraskan. How long have you been in Alabama, and what brought you here?
Yeah, I was working at Sports Illustrated in about 2004, living on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, when my wife at the time just came home from work. She was working at Red Book magazine, and she had some traumatic things happen in her own life, and she just said, "Hey, I can't live in New York anymore. And by the way, I just got a job at Southern Living in Alabama, and I'm going." And she said, "You can come if you want." And I probably should have realized then, like, maybe things weren't 100% great in the marriage. But anyway, I ended up moving with her down to Alabama. Sports Illustrated didn't care where I was living. I was covering mainly college football and NASCAR. And I remember the night before I left New York City, I gathered with a bunch of my friends on the Upper West Side at a watering hole there. I hadn't told them yet that I was leaving, and I'd said to them that I was moving to Alabama. And one of my friends remarked, "Man, Lars, I think there's 49 other states I'd rather move to than Alabama." So I'd never been to the state of Alabama before, so didn't really know what I was getting myself into. But here we are. Here I am 14 years later. I absolutely love it. This is my home. Subsequently, that marriage didn't work out. Ended up marrying an Alabama girl, and we now have 3 kids under the age of 4, so got my hands full with that. Teach at the university, and just have become very sort of embedded in life in Alabama, and again, just absolutely love it.
Now, you grew up in Nebraska. What part of Nebraska?
I grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska, which is the capital, and also the home of University of Nebraska. Yeah, so I'm a big Husker fan. These are falling on hard times, but I loved my hometown so much that I named my firstborn son Lincoln after where I grew up, and he's now 3.5. And people often ask me, hey, if it comes down to Alabama or Nebraska, who you're pulling for? And my standard response is, I named my son Lincoln, not Tuscaloosa. So I'm always gonna be partial to the Huskers if that ever comes to pass.
Well, I know that you guys signed a coach new to your program, but not new to the team. I know he was quarterback back in the day, and he turned around the other supposed. They're claiming a national championship from last year, highly debated, particularly where you are right now in Tuscaloosa. But maybe Frost can turn it around.
Yeah, I knew Scott. Did a story on Scott when he was a player at Nebraska, and I never forget. Went down there, and he was a junior, and we went out on the Memorial Stadium field, and we were just tossing around a football, and he's like, "Lars, go deep, go deep." So I ran. It got to the 30, the 40, the 50, and he keeps waving me. Got to the 40, the 30, throws the ball, and it travels 73 yards in the air, and it was like he didn't even put any effort into it. But happy to report that I did catch the pass, and Scott's off to a rough start, but I have no doubt that he'll turn this thing around.
If they'll give him some time, I suspect the
Cornhuskers. Look, if he can't do it, nobody can, and if people in Nebraska realize that, and I know there's been speculation recently that people are frustrated with Scott, and I don't see any names behind that. It's a lot of anonymous sources, and trust me, he's perfectly fine. He could lose every game for the next 2 years, and fans would have patience with him.
Well, that is probably a welcome change, considering the got to win at all costs, got to win right now mentality of most major programs. But hopefully your Cornhuskers will turn it around.
Yeah,
Maybe they'll
again,
pull it.
I think they will.
Are the Sooners on the schedule for later this year?
Sorry, what was that?
Is Oklahoma on the schedule for later this
No,
year?
no, we don't have a no. That date in November no longer exists, unfortunately. Some of my greatest memories were going to games with my dad growing up, going to the Oklahoma game when it was often Nebraska was one, Oklahoma was two, or Oklahoma was two, Nebraska was number one, and just a lot of great memories, which I've written about at length over the course of my career. Just about the experiences I had going to football games with my dad, and he was the one who really instilled the love of sport in me. And unfortunately, I lost him quite a few years ago, but he's now buried in Arlington National Cemetery. He served 43 years in the Navy. He was a lawyer, was Navy JAG, and very, very proud of him, and look forward to taking all my kids up to Arlington to see him one day.
Well, certainly, and that was going to lead me. I wanted to ask you, who were some of your early influences that got you started and wanting to head down the path of being a journalist?
Well, really, I wanted to be, at first, I wanted to be a lawyer. I wanted to follow in my dad's shoes. And my dad was a defense lawyer, and he was a litigator. And I would go and watch his opening and closing arguments, and he wrote all of them out by hand on those yellow legal pads. And really, what that taught me was that he was a writer as much as an attorney. And so he sort of bestowed his love of writing onto me, and I went and spent some time in Washington, D.C. when I was in college. I went to St. Olaf College for undergraduate, which is in Northfield, Minnesota, and ended up working for Senator Bob Kerrey. He was running for president at the time in 1992. Went up to New Hampshire, and it seemed like every time there would be about five of us at an event, we'd look across the street and there'd be about 200 people for Clinton, this guy, the Southern governor who had never heard of before. Just the organization that the Clintons had in New Hampshire, even back in '92, was unbelievable. But I thought maybe politics and law would be a way to go for me, but I really wanted to focus more on my own writing. And so I applied to Columbia Journalism School in New York City. I was fortunate enough to get into Columbia. And then right after Columbia, I was able to finagle my way and get a tryout at Sports Illustrated at age 23, and then ended up spending 20 years at Sports Illustrated, mostly covering college football. I mean, I covered everything, but a lot of college football, a lot of NASCAR, baseball, hockey, just sort of all sorts of stories. And then I also wrote books the whole time when I was at Sports Illustrated. I've now just finished my 9th book, which we can talk about in a little bit. But after Sports Illustrated, I joined Bleacher Report, where I was a primary long-form writer for Bleacher. Covered the Rio Olympics, did stories from Israel, literally just all around the world. Bleacher was wonderful because they had just unlimited money because of their relationship with Turner. And so I was a beneficiary of that, of traveling everywhere. But, once you have small kids, it's like the desire to get on that airplane diminishes greatly. And I'd spent almost 25 years on airplanes, so I wanted to kind of calm down a little bit. And so I'm now in my 5th year of teaching at Alabama. They give me great sort of latitude to do some other things, but I feel very fortunate, and also working for Walt Maddox, running for governor, the Democratic candidate for governor of Alabama, and working for Walt as his speechwriter.
Gosh, so many places to go from there. What did you ever think that you'd be traveling as much as you did when you started out your writing career?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I thought I was just going to start working at a small newspaper somewhere covering high school sports, and instead, by age 20, I think wrote my first cover story when I was 25. It was on Lawrence Phillips, who played at Nebraska. And that cover story was the beginning of a long relationship I had with Lawrence. And Lawrence ran into some difficulties in his life, to put it mildly. ended up in prison out at Kern Valley State Prison in the San Joaquin Valley in California. Ended up writing a couple stories about Lawrence right at the end of his life. He ended up killing his cellmate in a mano on mano fight in their tiny little cell, and then he was charged with the murder of his cellmate. And then right before he went to trial for that, he ended up taking his own life. And based on my reporting, I hooked up with this guy Ross Greenberg, who used to be the head of HBO Sports, and Ross and I and Armand Katayan, who from 60 Minutes, and a couple other really great people ended up doing an hour-and-a-half documentary on Lawrence for Showtime. And you just you never know where things are going to go. And one of the first big stories I wrote at Sports Illustrated, I revisited it almost 20 years later.
It really shows you it's not necessarily all how smart you are or what you know, but a lot of times it's who it leads you to and who you know that can ultimately lead to stories like this. And it really is just remarkable. I've followed your career. I've probably read almost every single thing you've published, and I appreciate and thank you for all of that entertainment and hard work that I know you've put into it. And for those of you just joining us or watching us later on, I'm with journalist, author, professor, and speechwriter Lars Anderson. And Lars has given us a few minutes of his time so far about part of his career. And gosh, the next place I want to go, Lars, is go back to when you first started at Sports Illustrated. I don't know if you were hired on with a class of or a group of writers, or if you just came in at a particular time on your own. But share with us sports fans, us fans who've had Sports Illustrated subscriptions since they were 6 years old. What other writers came in about the same time and kind of grew up with you at that time when you started out in your 20s?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the guys who were Chris Stone, who runs Sports Illustrated now, Jeff Pearlman, who's written multiple New York Times bestsellers, Chad Millman, who went on to become the top editor at ESPN.com and ESPN, the magazine, David Fleming, who is a SI writer, who is a senior writer at ESPN. I mean, the list goes on. And it's funny, when all of us were in our early to mid 20s, late 20s, none of us really had significant others. And our work week started on Thursday. It would be Thursday, Friday, off Saturday, and then Sunday, Monday. And Sunday was really the long day that you'd be in the office in New York. And so to have any sort of social life, you'd be forced to hang out with the people you worked with because everybody else had normal working hours. And so we played basketball together. We played softball together in the park. I mean, we had so much fun together in our 20s in New York. And this was also a time when Sports Illustrated was really the sort of destination required reading for any serious sports fan. And unfortunately, the Sports Illustrated has sort of lost quite a bit of its luster over the years because of the rise of ESPN. Sports Illustrated was very slow to embrace the internet. When SI.com first launched, there was sort of this struggle between the magazine writers and the .com writers, and it was almost like as magazine writers, we felt it was beneath us to write for .com, and that was just the culture of it back then. It seems silly now, now it seems absolutely nuts, but that was the thinking back then. And so the seeds of SI's demise were sown a long, long time ago. And, it's now down to every other week. And frankly, I can see a point here in the next 5 years where the magazine actually doesn't exist, which is sad.
That would be a sad day for a lot of sports fans, but I certainly can see where it's going that way. When you first started out at SI, did any of the authors take you under their wing? Were there any who kind of helped show you the way, or were you just kind of thrown out there to sink or swim?
Oh, I had so many mentors at Sports Illustrated. A lot of editors who, that most people wouldn't know their names, but in terms of writers, Alexander Wolf, I believe, is in the NCAA Hall of Fame in the writers wing. He really helped me at the very beginning. He gave me a great piece of advice that I always share with my students, and that is, if you only use 10% of your notes, you know that you're going to have an amazing story. And so that means you report, 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 report. If you're struggling with your writing, if you have writer's block, make another phone call. And Alex also helped me get my first book deal. He knew a literary agent that he introduced me to. I pitched the literary agent my idea, and he went for it. Ended up writing with Chad Millman, who I said went to ESPN, and it was called Pickup Artists, and it was about playground basketball in America. And specifically, what we did is we went around the country and we interviewed the top players, the top playground player that we could find in New York, in Philly, in Los Angeles, in Chicago, and find out their story of why they didn't make it. I did a whole chapter on drug basketball where two drug dealers would get their top five together in New York City, and they'd wager $100,000. And the top player in this drug league, his name was Speedy Williams, and Speedy said that he actually could make more money playing drug basketball than in the NBA. A little bit of hyperbole there, but and I also did a chapter on prison basketball and what prison ball was like, and I focused on this guy named Derek Curry. He was serving 22 years, 7 months with no chance of parole, and for a nonviolent crime, and that was he was driving a car in Washington, D.C. from point A to point B. Car gets pulled over. It had been followed by the feds. Underneath the passenger's seat was a football-sized thing of crack cocaine. Because it was crack, mandatory sentencing kicked in. If it had been powder, it would have been a much softer sentence. Anyway, long story short, ended up writing a pretty sympathetic 6,000-word chapter on Derek. His parents, who were both educators in the D.C. area, they put that book in front of every congressman they could find. They eventually got it in front of President Bill Clinton, and about 10 minutes before Clinton left office, he gave Derek Curry a pardon. And it was because of the book and because of what we had written that really taught me the power of the pen. And Derek called me. Literally, he walked across the street after getting out of FCI Cumberland, the federal facility he was in, and just crying on the phone, thanked me for writing about him.
What year was that? That's a great story. Lars, you still there?
Yeah. Yep.
What year was that? Where you helped the fellow get out of jail?
The book was published in 1998, and it was right when Clinton got out of office. So that was Clinton's last year. It was literally on his last day in office that he pardoned Derek Curry.
On a personal note, did that take any sting out of losing the 92 presidential election, or at least the bid for you personally to Clinton?
No, I wasn't involved in politics at that time.
Of all the books that you've written, and I presume that at least the ones that I have read, they've been sports related. Are there any books that you wish to write a follow-up to, a chapter or two, to kind of bring the story more modern? Is there anything that's come to mind of late?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to do another chapter just on the storm in the tide, which is about the tornado that went through Tuscaloosa, Alabama on April 27th, 2011. I did a book on the Manning family. It'd be easy to update that, especially now. It looks like this is probably going to be Eli's last year.
Maybe his last game or two, frankly.
Yeah, really. Yeah, yeah. And I just did a book. My most recent book is going to be out here at the end of October. It's called The Truth About Aaron. I wrote it with Jonathan Hernandez, who's the brother of Aaron Hernandez. And we dig deep into Aaron's life and not being, we don't condone any of his behavior. We don't, hey, we weren't even there the night that everything went down. Wasn't the night that Odin Lloyd was killed, and we don't presume to know what happened that night. But the bigger question is, why was Aaron there that night? Why was he hanging out with guys who had criminal records when he could have been hanging out with guys like Tom Brady. It sort of raises all these questions, and we drill pretty deep into it.
Were you involved with the Boston Globe podcast that's coming out now, Gladiator?
No, I'm not involved with that. I just heard about that recently, but no, I'm not involved with that.
I listened to the first two episodes yesterday, and just from the little bit that I listened, and I'm sure you go into this much deeper, quite a fascinating story. Very sad, but quite fascinating. So I look
Yeah.
forward to reading your
No,
book.
I think Aaron's story. There's so many elements to it, and it's so complicated, and it's so unique that it still has resonance all these years later. And there have already been multiple books written about it. James Patterson, about the best-selling author in the world, just did a book with Clinton. He comes out with a book about every 3 weeks, it seems like. But he did a book on it called All-American Murderer. I thought it was overly sympathetic to the prosecution's case. I thought that all of his information came from the prosecution. It was basically him being a mouthpiece for the police. But, that's okay. But then Jose Baez, who represented Casey Anthony and then also represented Aaron, he came out with his own book. And now Aaron's brother, Jonathan, and I are coming out with our book. And look, nobody knew him better than his brother. They were best friends. They looked just alike. Jonathan is 3 years older. He played quarterback at UConn and was constantly providing counsel to Aaron. And so Jonathan and I think, take readers to places where no one else has been in this story. And I do think it's going to shed a lot of new light on the entire Aaron Hernandez saga.
It just shows you've done a couple of other books about flawed athletes, and they're not to get on a soapbox of any sort, but it's almost as if that kind of writes a book itself about how these athletes are revered on the field for their physical abilities, their prowess, their hero status for in being within a team setting, and then you get them off of the field, and they're just human beings, just like everybody else. But their flaws seem to be magnified just because of who they are. And take Hernandez and take Lawrence Phillips as two prime examples.
Yeah, no, exactly. But I have also, I've written a lot of, especially magazine stories on tragedy and death and just in sort of difficult circumstances. But I have written some books too about true American heroes. I wrote a book called The All-Americans, which was about the 1941 Army-Navy game that was played 8 days before Pearl Harbor was attacked. I followed two guys from Army, two guys from Navy, from their experiences through the game and then to the war. Then I also wrote a book called Carlyle versus Army, which is about the Carlyle Army football game played in 1912. Carlyle's star player was Jim Thorpe. Carlyle's coach was Pop Warner. And Army star player was Dwight Eisenhower. And at the key moment of the game, Eisenhower and Thorpe come together, and Thorpe absolutely just blows up Eisenhower, and Eisenhower shreds his knee. Eisenhower wanted to become a professional baseball player, and this interaction with Thorpe ended his sports career, and he ended up doing the next best thing in his mind the next year, and he became an assistant coach on the West Point football team. And that was the first time that he really realized that young men would sort of follow his lead. And then he also became a cheerleader, and he would lead on Friday nights. He would lead the Corps of Cadets in cheers and at pep rallies. And it was the first time that he realized that he had a real facility with words in front of a large group. And I argue in the book that this not only altered the trajectory of Eisenhower's career, but it altered the trajectory of American history because of what Eisenhower would do on D-Day and against sort of long odds, tell everybody to press forward even though the weather was so bad. And then once he became president, he actually invited Thorpe to the Oval Office, and so they got together again after all those years. And And this book has recently been optioned by Angelina Jolie's film company, and it looks like they're going to start shooting here in January.
Oh, fantastic. Any chance you'll make a cameo?
I'm hoping. As soon as they sort of get their schedule down, I'm hoping to be a part of it.
We want to see you in all leathers on the field. That would be a good spot for you.
Well, I think they're going to be doing some filming in Stockholm, Sweden, where the Olympics were in 1912, and
Wow.
the actual stadium is still there in existence. So, but I don't know how the weather is going to be in January in Stockholm, but so we'll.
For those of you joining us, I'm speaking with author, journalist, and speechwriter Lars Anderson. Lars, thank you for giving us some of your time, and I want to kind of pivot into what you're doing these days. I know you teach at the University of Alabama. You're also a speechwriter, right, or the speechwriter right now for governor candidate Walt Maddox. So share with us a little bit about how those two things are keeping you busy these days.
Yeah, in 2011, I began just teaching at Alabama on an adjunct basis, just teaching one class a semester. And once I decided to leave Sports Illustrated, I think it was in 2014, a position came open at Alabama, a full-time faculty position, and interviewed for it, was able to become a full-time faculty member. I absolutely love being on campus, being around the students and interacting with the students and just sharing stories that I've written in the past and just again just being a part of the university is so wonderful. And I got to know Walt Maddox when I wrote a cover story for Sports Illustrated on the tornado that again ripped through Tuscaloosa on April 27th. Met Mayor Maddox out in the devastated area just about 2 weeks after the tornado. Was very impressed with how he led Tuscaloosa through that very painful experience. I reconnected with him again when I wrote The Storm in the Tide. He's actually like a character in the book, so to speak. And once he announced that he was running for governor, I reached out to him and said, hey, I'd love to help in any capacity. And just, went down to his office. I remember this was months ago. It was right when he announced, and they had just sort of opened up the campaign headquarters, and literally knocked on the door, and Walt answered. So, and then I did some work for him in the primary, really focusing on his speech that he gave after on election night when he won the nomination. And now I've just done little bits and pieces for him here. He likes I think he likes me to do a draft, and then he works off the draft. But we do have a good sort of rapport of working back and forth together. And currently working on his victory speech for November 6th.
Very good. Now we've only got about 3 weeks left until the actual vote. Do you think we'll have a debate?
Oh no. Kay Ivey won't debate Walt. She knows that is a losing proposition for her on many fronts. I would argue both on the intellectual front and just I don't think physically that she could be on a stage for over 90 minutes. So no, that her people have already said multiple times that they won't debate. And look, I thought we lived in a participatory democracy, but my friends on the other side of the aisle don't think that way apparently.
Doesn't appear to be that way. We're getting close to the end, and Lars, again, I appreciate your time and your candor. Do you have any plans for any upcoming books? I know you're just now putting out one in October on Aaron Hernandez, but you seem to always have another one that's next.
I do. I have one cooking right now, and my literary agent and I have talked to a publisher in New York, and I think we're going to get actually something worked out this week. So hopefully I'll have an announcement next week. But I'll say this: if I've had some bad luck in the past when I have actually revealed sort of what I was planning on doing before. It's like you don't think the word gets out, but it does. Like for instance, my Carlyle versus Army book, right? This book that took place in 1912. Well, I won't mention the writer's name, but they found out what I was doing, and they ended up going and getting a contract, and she actually beat me out by about a month. And it was very, very disappointing and disheartening, and so it's a fool me once kind of thing. I won't
Sure,
let that happen
sure.
again.
Well, we'll make sure we look out for your announcement, hopefully in the upcoming days or weeks. In closing, I want you to give me a compare and contrast Nebraska versus Alabama. Not necessarily and always about football, but let me give you some topics. Okay? Talk to us. Compare and contrast life in Lincoln, Nebraska versus life in Birmingham or Tuscaloosa.
Well, life in Lincoln, believe it or not, is a little faster paced, and it's not. It's more about having steak, a lot of steak. People aren't as quite concerned about food. And Nebraska, in Nebraska, it's all about one thing, and that's Nebraska football. And in Alabama, it's all about Auburn and on the University of Alabama. And there's that tension, and I think it's the greatest rivalry in all of sports. And look, I lived in New York City a long time and got familiar with the Yankees and Red Sox rivalry. But I would challenge anyone to come here and live through a year of Auburn, Alabama, and it's wonderful. And the one thing, the weather here is far superior. After going to college in Minnesota and then growing up in Nebraska, I swore I would never live outside of the South once I got down here. I'm a huge golfer, and the golfing in Alabama is just off the charts. Love playing the Robert Trent Jones courses, and the golf is always what sustains me here. But with three little ones, it's hard to find the time.
Well, when you do have the time to go to a Bama football game, compare that experience with your experiences going to see the Cornhuskers play.
Yeah, it's vastly different because the Alabama games and really the SEC in general, but particularly here in Tuscaloosa, it's an all-day social event. And it's, the students dress up for it. People get here, it's so early. Whereas Nebraska, it's more that people in Lincoln, they kind of hang out downtown get a beer at a bar or something, and then just walk over to the stadium. There really isn't the tailgating or the all-day event. But once you're inside, the atmosphere, I would say, is equally electric in both stadiums. But it's a cultural difference really between the SEC and what used to be the Big 8 and now is the Big 10. It's just the tailgating is nowhere near the extreme and the fun. I mean, I love it. I think in a lot of ways what happens before the game is actually more enjoyable than what happens during the game. And so that's the main difference, is really just the social aspect of Alabama football.
Have you been in Bryant Denny for Dixieland Delight or Rammer Jammer?
No, not Dixieland Delight. No, I haven't been to a game yet this year. I'm sure it played when I was covering different games, but I was in the press box and not paying attention to it. But now, I'm also doing a radio show with Jay Barker in Tuscaloosa and in Birmingham, and we're about ready to expand our footprint all across Alabama. And Jay talks very reverentially about Dixieland Delight.
Isn't Alec Lewis on his way up? What a cool kid.
He is, yeah. Alec was on it. We had him on our show just the other day. He's a great young man, and I met with Alec, who's a Birmingham native. Met with him when he was in high school and tried to offer as much counsel as possible. And he's going to be a star if he's not already.
I think he is, and I think he's only headed up. All right, last question, most important question. Barbecue in Alabama versus whatever they offer in Nebraska. What can you tell us?
Prime rib at Nebraska. You can go to this place called Misty's Lounge in Lincoln, and you can get a prime rib that's bigger than your head. So I gotta go with prime rib. I was raised on Nebraska beef, And so that's it. But hey, I love barbecue too. I especially I love Dreamland. Like who doesn't?
Right.
Dimitri's. I mean, all sorts of places. The food in the South is absolutely wonderful.
Well, Lars, I can't thank you enough for your time. I know how incredibly busy you are these days, but thank you for your insight. Thank you for sharing your stories with us.
Hey, I really appreciate you having me on. Thank you so much.
And guys, if you're watching this later on, I'm going to put in the comments section some of the stories that and books that Lars has written, so you can have access to that. I'll put his. I assume you have an Amazon authors page. I'll put that on there.
Hmm.
Uh, and of course, we'll be back with you every Tuesday as we are with Nomberg Law Live. So thank you guys for spending some time with us. These are great stories. And Lars, I wish you the best in about 3 weeks in early November.
All right, thank you, sir. Appreciate it.